Hello and welcome to this symposium at the 32nd International Congress of Psychology. And this is the Symposium on Homelessness and Cognitive Functioning. I will be chairing it. My name is Gaëtan Pluck. And I'd just like to, before we start the presentations, I'd give you a quick summary of what to expect. We have 3 presentations today. I will be giving the first presentation, and I will give this on adult homelessness and language ability. Next, we have a presenter from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, Beth Stone, and she's going to present on cognitive impairment and homelessness, an examination of prevalence and risk factors with a focus on autism spectrum disorders. And for our third presentation, we have Gaëtan Chevreau of Paris 8 University in France, and he's going to be presenting on neuropsychology at homeless services, suitability and challenges for practice and research. Okay, so I'll start with my presentation. And again, I told you I'm going to talk about language ability, and I'm going to be describing some research which I did in Ecuador in South America when I was at the Institute of Neurosciences at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. However, I'm currently based at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Okay, so I'm also going to use this presentation to give a little bit of background to the issue of homelessness and cognitive function in psychology, so that we can give some context to the overall seminar, symposium. So homelessness, of course, includes people sleeping in public places. Often, people are aware of this. You see this in many cities. Call that rough sleeping. But also, homelessness can be people living in tents because they don't have a proper or a good quality housing. This is common, for example, in Japan. It could be people living in overcrowded accommodation or inappropriate accommodation. That could also be homelessness. And of course, people may be living in homeless hostels, long term or day by day. And there's also people squatting in vacant buildings. And these are just some of the manifestations for homelessness. Really, it covers any person who's lacking a secure tenancy. Okay, so some more background of homelessness. It's common in most, maybe all developed in middle-income countries. It's most commonly men, most commonly single, and most commonly adults. Now I'll give some statistics about the USA because that is a country which has a particularly prominent homeless population, and it's one which there are reliable statistics for as well. And any night in the USA, it's estimated to be about 500,000 people are homeless. And for many people, that will be quite a short-term status, maybe only a few weeks due to financial difficulties or a loss of tenancy or being kicked out of their apartment. But for a large proportion of people, maybe up to 90,000 adults in the USA, it's a chronic condition in which they are homeless for year on year. Okay, so it is a sizable problem, a sizable issue, should I say. Now I work in Bangkok, I live in Bangkok. Again, we have the same issue. There are probably about 400 homeless people on the streets in Bangkok, people actually living rough in the streets. And many, up to 40% probably, are actually working, perhaps in construction or recycling garbage, but they can't afford a proper tenancy or place to live. The research I'm going to present was mainly conducted in Quito in South America, the capital city of Ecuador, and we have the same issue there. This is a photo from Quito, and there are lots of single men, often with mental health problems or drink or alcohol problems, living homeless in the main cities, particularly Quito. Okay, so why are we interested as psychologists? Why are we talking about cognitive function and homeless adults? Well, the main reason is There are a lot of neurological health concerns related to homelessness. There's a lot of reason to suspect, a lot of reason to be concerned about the cognitive and neurological health of people who are homeless. Depending on the studies and the methods used, but alcohol dependence is usually found to be unusually high amongst homeless populations, perhaps 8 to 59%. Similar figures for drug dependence, depending on the sample and the methods used to measure. Schizophrenia, again, can be vary widely on the samples. Sometimes it's very low proportion, sometimes a very high proportion of patients positive for schizophrenia. And again, traumatic brain injury can be very common amongst homeless populations. And Beth, who's going to speak after me, will mention some more statistics on this, some more interpretation of this. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the cognitive impairment prevalence estimates vary widely from sample to sample, between 2 and 82%. And as I'll explain in my presentation here, partly this is due to sort of not very good methods being used to define abnormality, define impairment in much of the research. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of the research on homelessness and cognitive ability. And I'm going to sort of point out some of the weaknesses. And I don't mean to pick on particular researchers or authors here. I'm just using these as examples because these are issues which are very common in the research which is extant. And this is a fairly typical study. This was actually women this time in the United States, 25 mothers and their children in homeless hostels. They were assessed for their language skills. And the scores of the homeless mothers were then compared to the published norms for the United States. And the authors found sort of between 16 and 36% of the mothers would be considered to have a deficit in cognitive function, or in language function in this case. Now, the reason I think this is a problematic way of looking at things is that when you use normative data, all you're actually looking at is how does this person compare to the average in the country as a whole? So how does this person compare with the average American of a similar age? And actually, people who become homeless are probably not actually typical of the citizens, in that they usually or more commonly come from a lower socioeconomic status background in the beginning. Many people who become homeless have come from living in care or from foster families. And many have come from quite poor backgrounds to begin with. And so it's not really fair to compare them to the norm for the population. Now, to make this point, it's known pretty well, there's lots of research on this, that children who live in poor, low socioeconomic status backgrounds perform worse than middle-class children on a range of cognitive tests. Okay. Now this is effect sizes. So this chart shows how worse the poor children were compared to more privileged middle-class children in some research in the United States. And you can see the language ability was much worse in the poor children, almost one standard deviation or one effect size worse. Working memory and cognitive control, two sort of executive function measures, were also much lower, as was declarative memory. And so when you're looking at memory, sort of language function, and you compare currently homeless people to the norm population, it's not really the correct comparison. They should be compared to people from the same socioeconomic background if you're trying to detect deficit or impairment. Okay, so that's one way it's done in the extant literature. Now, also some studies include a control group. Now, often it is better to include a control group rather than rely on normative data. You have much more control, and you can match the controls much more closely to your population of interest. However, it has to be done well, otherwise you can get spurious or misleading results. Now, in this research, I wanted to just use to highlight this issue, 30 homeless adults, again in the United States, were compared to 30 controls. And these controls were actually volunteers working in the shelters, but they were the same age, the same race mix, and the same gender mix as the homeless adults. Now, the problem here is that people working in the shelters aren't necessarily from the same socioeconomic background as the homeless adults. Okay. They may be, but we don't know that from this sort of research. And whenever you compare a target group to a control group, any difference can be caused by the control being inappropriate, or the control being much more higher functioning than you expect them to. So we have to be very suspicious or careful interpreting when there isn't a very close control group. And in fact, it's very difficult to see how you can match a good control group to homelessness. Now, there are ways around this, and that's what I'm going to explain to you today. Now, this is what I did in Sheffield a few years ago. Sheffield in the United Kingdom is a country with a sizable population of homeless people, homeless adults. And I administered the Wechsler intelligence scales to 80 homeless adults, and I found the mean IQ score was about 84. So again, this is comparing to normative data, which I'm saying is a little bit unfair. But we can use that to make the point, at least, that if we look at people scoring in the low average or borderline or extremely low, that's where the homeless tended to score. They tended to score, their scores were shifted down. And in fact, the mean score of 84 is about one standard deviation, one effect size below what would be expected for a typical English adult or British adult. Okay. Now, again, this is not a fair comparison to make, because in Sheffield, most of the homeless population are coming from working class families. They're coming from families who have suffered socioeconomic deprivation. Many of them are coming out of care. So comparing to the average British person is not really appropriate anyway. But what you can do, if you use better sort of neuropsychological methods, is to estimate premorbid function. Now, we can estimate premorbid function in English and then compare it to current cognitive function and look for the difference. Now, in English, the main tests to do this are things like Wechsler test of adult reading, or the National Adult Reading Test, or the more recent test, premorbid functioning. But they all involve the same sort of procedure, and it was reading aloud irregular, low-frequency words. So words such as yacht, paradigm, syncope. And if a person pronounces these well, they probably had good premorbid cognitive functioning. But there are tables we can get pretty much exact. We can get very precise estimates of what their memory and what their intelligence scores should be in a current assessment. Now, to give you an idea of the logic, this is just hypothetical data. And if we look first at the healthy performance, in a healthy person with no neurological or no neurodevelopmental or no psychiatric problems, the estimated premorbid ability should be pretty similar to what you measure currently. So you do an IQ test and you get this score, and you give the premorbid measure, you should get something like this. If instead you find something like this, the estimated premorbid is much higher than the current ability, then this is quite suggestive of cognitive impairment. In fact, this is used almost routinely in neuropsychological assessment. Okay, but we can use this in research too. So I did this with the same sample of homeless people in Sheffield, and we find memory scores were significantly lower than their premorbid estimates. IQ scores were significantly lower than premorbid estimates. Memory scores were also significantly more affected than IQ scores. And this is exactly the pattern we would predict if there was some cognitive impairment in the sample. So we are still finding sort of the same results, but we're doing it in a much more fair way. We're doing it on a personal level and identifying individuals who may be performing lower than you would expect them to. So that's the methodology which can be used. Now, it's still better, if possible, to use a control group rather than relying just on normative data. But when you do this, you have to be very careful working any sort of socioeconomic or excluded groups to get as best a best matched control as you can. Now in Ecuador, what we decided to do, we tried to match on education level for the controls on the homeless adults, because SES, or socioeconomic status, is very highly correlated with education level. Education is a good proxy measure of family socioeconomic status in childhood. So we recorded 17 homeless adults from Quito, and they had an average education level of about 6 years, so pretty low actually, even for a developing country like Ecuador. And we found 16 age-matched controls. They have the same level of education, so only about 6 years of education on average. We assessed their current language ability and their pre-morbid language ability, and we did the pre-morbid with a Spanish test similar to the one I provided earlier. I suggested in Spanish you do this with accentation on words. So in order to pronounce these words, you need to know where the accent is, and if you can pronounce them as acuja, pugil, polygamo, then you're probably scoring quite high on this pre-morbid measure. Okay. So that's how its pre-morbid estimation can be done in Spanish. We can measure current language ability with things like the Boston Diagnostic Phaser Examination. People maybe recognize this, the Boston cookie theft picture. That's one of the tests, and there's also lots of other language tests. It measures many different aspects of language ability, including comprehension and actual language output. So we were able to get both of these measures, pre-morbid and current, and compare them in a control group and a homeless group. Okay. Now again, this is effect sizes, but this time this is the effect of how worse the homeless participant was compared to their matched control participant. And of course, these are matched this time for both education and pre-morbid ability, and effectively they're measured for family socioeconomic background. Okay. So even with this strict matching procedure, we found that the homeless participants scored about an effect size 0.6 below the controls on auditory comprehension and also on oral expression. And there were both significant differences, and there were probably effects really for reading and writing too, but they were not significant in our relatively small sample. But nevertheless, this shows that there is a language issue associated with homelessness. It can't be just the socioeconomic status of the people. Their language ability is worse than would be expected based on their socioeconomic background. Okay, so my specific conclusions from the research are the homeless sample did indeed have language skills below what would be expected based on SES background. And this suggests language pathology. Now this could be acquired, for example, head injuries while homeless, or it could be due to a developmental language disorder. The methodology I used doesn't really allow us to separate the two. And I think Beth is going to talk after me. She's going to talk a little bit more about developmental issues and how these maybe are associated with homelessness and cognitive function. Now, often I'm told that we shouldn't really talk about these specific conclusions because it could be used to stigmatize homeless people. But I think that really that's not a good attitude. If there are a lot of homeless people with unusually poor linguistic ability, poor comprehension and poor communication skills, it's very useful for people who work with homeless people to know this, for nurses and for care staff, and for people in hostels, for example. Because often information is given to homeless people with letters, they're given appointments. So that can be taken into account if we acknowledge there is an issue. And secondly, as this is probably a language pathology, this means that there is potential for speech and language therapy. We may be able to actually improve the lives of people who are homeless by helping them improve their language skills, and this may help them towards more stable life trajectories. Okay. Now, my more general and wider message is that using normative data with people from low SES backgrounds will over-pathologize them. It always will. Okay. as will badly matched control groups in research. Quasi-experimental designs where we compare a target group with a sort of matched control group are often done quite poorly, and it can produce the wrong results, and it can over-pathologize people. Really, it is better to calculate personalized assessments of what would be expected from each individual if they had no cognitive disorder. I've shown you ways that can be done with word reading ability, and those tests exist in several languages. I've used them in Japanese and in Spanish and in English, and they exist in lots of other languages too. Other ways can be regression-based norming, which I think is actually a fairer method of establishing sort of a norm point than the usual tables in statistical manuals. Okay, now that's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank my collaborators, Jose Hernandez and Alejandro Martinez in Quito. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can contact me on social media. I think there will be a question and answer session ongoing here in this online platform, and so I'll be here for that during the live session. But now it's time for me to change my role, change from presenter, change to chair. And I'd like to introduce the next speaker today. We have three speakers, and the next one is Beth Stone from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And she's going to give us a presentation on cognitive impairment and homelessness, an examination of prevalence and risk factors with a focus on autism spectrum disorders. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Beth Stone and I'm based at the University of Bristol in the UK. Today I'm going to be speaking about cognitive impairments and homelessness with a focus on my doctoral research on autism and homelessness. I'm sorry I can't attend today, but please do get in touch if you have any questions or want to discuss anything further. My email's at the bottom of this slide and I'll also include it at the end. So just to give a brief framework for this presentation, I'll begin by providing a brief background on homelessness and autism in the UK context. I'll then discuss my scoping review on homelessness and cognitive impairments more generally, before moving on to briefly discuss a piece of narrative research I recently completed exploring the link between autism and homelessness. And I'll finish just by considering some implications with a focus on implications for services. So homelessness in the UK has risen dramatically over the last decade. Pre-COVID, roughly 1 in 200 people were reportedly experiencing a form of homelessness, and we've seen a 141% rise in rough sleeping since 2010. Now these figures are likely to increase even further over the next few years as the economic and social ramifications of the pandemic become clearer. What is interesting in England is that in order to be legally defined as homeless, you have to meet certain criteria. And in order to be eligible to receive support, or what is known as homelessness duty, you have to meet a further set of conditions which qualify you as being in priority need. Now these conditions include factors like being pregnant, having dependent children, or being a care leaver. But there's also a clause of vulnerability. So one could be vulnerable as a result of old age, mental illness, or disability. But this does not automatically qualify you as having priority need. And these criteria are often applied subjectively, or their application may vary depending on geographical region. And I just wanted to highlight this as it's a really important point in consideration of both cognitive impairments and autism. And I'll return to that in a bit later on. So now thinking specifically about autism spectrum disorder, or autism and life outcomes in the UK. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, autism is usually defined as a lifelong developmental disability, which impacts how people perceive and interact with the world around them. It's commonly associated with social deficits and restrictive and repetitive behaviours, and it's not a homogeneous condition, so people can present with a variety of different behaviours or needs. So we know that whilst diagnostic rates are similar in children and adults in the UK are actually underdiagnosed. So recent estimates suggest only 1 in 10 adults with autism in the UK has a clinical diagnosis. And without this diagnosis, many autistic adults are not accessing support. And although there's a lack of research on autism across the life course, a small number of outcome studies have highlighted how autistic adults are susceptible to economic disadvantages such as high unemployment rates and poverty. Similarly, we know that autistic adults are vulnerable to social disadvantages such as reduced social support networks, increased isolation, and vulnerability to relationship breakdown or abuse. And what is interesting here is that these disadvantages are also commonly listed as risk factors to or contributors towards homelessness, suggesting autistic adults might be at an increased risk of becoming homeless. However, despite these considerations, there's only a handful of studies which have directly examined the link between autism and homelessness. And due to this lack of information, I decided to undertake a scoping review in the hopes that a more systematic approach would capture papers on autism and homelessness. However, given the lack of research in this field and the overlap of autism and other conditions such as ADHD, learning disabilities and mental health, I decided to look at cognitive impairment more generally. So in looking at cognitive impairment more generally, cognitive impairment was defined as an impairment which affects cognitive ability. But we can really approach this definition from two different ways. The first way is by thinking about the functional element of a cognitive impairment, and this is the impact an impairment has on specific abilities such as attention span, problem solving and memory, which in turn affect day-to-day functioning. A more clinical approach or clinical conceptualization concerns specific diagnoses which fall under the category of cognitive impairment, such as traumatic brain injury, dementia, or developmental disabilities like autism. Now, because of the symptoms which affect day-to-day functioning, and perhaps more importantly, how cognitive impairments are understood and supported by society, they're associated with poor social and economic outcomes, such as low educational attainment, decreased employment rates, difficulty building and maintaining relationships, and so on. So perhaps unsurprisingly then, initial explorations suggested cognitive impairments were overrepresented in homeless populations. So at the time of starting this project, no known reviews had looked comparatively at research examining cognitive impairments with different etiologies. So in light of this, three aims were adopted: to summarise existing research on homelessness and cognitive impairments and identify gaps in knowledge, to ascertain how common cognitive impairments are in homeless populations and how they're measured, and to identify risk factors to and perpetuators of homelessness for people with cognitive impairments. So the review started with a systematic search of 6 databases for keywords relating to homelessness and cognitive impairments, and this initially yielded 625 results. Database searches were combined with manual searches of reference lists from database results, grey literature, and authors known through pre-existing knowledge of the field. After inclusion and exclusion criteria were applied, 40 studies, which were represented across 45 papers, were selected. So selected texts went through a quality appraisal process, and if you'd like to see more detail on this or on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, I'll put a link to the paper at the end of this presentation. So in terms of focus, 32 studies were quantitative and primarily concerned with screening for cognitive impairment. 3 were qualitative, 1 was mixed methods, and there were 4 systematic reviews. 29 studies recruited from homeless populations. The other sampling frames included professionals who worked with the homeless, mental health service users, records of hospital admissions, and prison populations. And these were included because they either measured or discussed cognitive impairment in conjunction with homelessness. So importantly, all papers could be put into one of 3 categories. The first of these was cause unspecified, and there were 7 papers in this category. Now, these papers did not attempt to ascertain cause of cognitive impairment, but looked at presence of global cognitive impairment or specific brain deficits such as frontal lobe impairments. The second category, which 18 papers fell into, was acquired cognitive impairments. And these were impairments which were acquired in adulthood or through non-organic or external causes, such as traumatic brain injury or alcohol-related brain damage. The final category was developmental, and these were impairments with organic causes which developed before adulthood. And there were 15 papers in this category, and they included people with learning disabilities, autism, ADHD, and so on. So across all three categories, types of cognitive impairments were overrepresented in homeless populations. Similarly, in the minority of studies which did not sample from homeless populations, participants with cognitive impairment reported increased instances of homelessness. However, there was a great range of prevalence rates, and this could be partly accounted for by variations, not just in the sample size, but differences in the sampling frame and adopted definitions. So to use traumatic brain injury as an example, studies which define traumatic brain injury as a hit to the head which left one dazed and confused recorded much higher prevalence rates than those that define traumatic brain injury as a hit to the head which resulted in loss of consciousness. And also the measures that were employed had an impact. So studies employed many different measures even when looking at the same impairment. On the topic of measures, it was also observed that many had not been validated in homeless populations, and that the impact of other variables such as mental health, substance use and poverty were not always considered. So to illustrate this point, this table shows studies which measured learning disabilities in homeless populations. If we look at the last two columns, we can see a variety of measures being used to ascertain presence of learning disability and quite a range in recorded rates. What I think is important here, however, is that if you look at the top row, a study conducted in Mozambique, even at this lowest rate of 5.6%, this is above what we would expect to find in the general population. So due to the emphasis on prevalence, risk factors to homelessness or reasons why individuals have become homeless were often overlooked. What was apparent was that many of the risk factors which were mentioned were common across all three categories. So economic success was negatively associated with all types of cognitive impairment. Individuals had low employment rates following a traumatic brain injury, and developmental disabilities were associated with increased job instability. There were low levels of educational attainment where it had been recorded across all three categories. It was also suggested that cognitive impairments were associated with emotional and social problems which led to relationship breakdown. In the case of learning disabilities and autism, homelessness could occur when carers or family members passed away and there was no appropriate support system in place. Once homeless, data pointed towards social deficits such as difficulty interacting with support staff as perpetuators of homelessness. Almost all of the included studies reported high rates of co-occurring mental illness, and there were very high rates of substance dependency and misuse. Persons with a traumatic brain injury were likely to be using multiple substances, and in one study, a third of individuals with a learning disability attributed their homelessness to substance abuse. Overall, however, the complex interplay between substance use, mental health, cognitive impairments and homelessness was not well explored. So studies didn't ascertain whether co-occurring disorders had developed prior to or during homelessness, or consider the impact co-occurring disorders may have on employed measures. So in consideration of all these factors, there were worryingly low levels of awareness and support in services. So prior to homelessness, there was a lack of awareness and adapted support at welfare and housing services, and during homelessness, individuals were often offered unsuitable accommodation considering their social vulnerabilities. Finally, many risk factors and perpetuators of homelessness were suggested to be interlinked and bidirectional. So this is nicely exemplified in this illustration, which I borrowed from Barnes, one of the included studies, which shows how traumatic brain injury was not only a risk factor to homelessness due to decreased income and social support, but was also associated with the chance of sustaining a further traumatic brain injury once the person became homeless due to the increased likelihood of assault and elevated substance use. So I'll now refocus on autism, and the scoping review only included 3 papers which had exclusively looked at autism, although autistic people were captured in other samples. Additionally, the review highlighted a lack of qualitative research examining the lived experience of homelessness or risk factors to homelessness for autistic people. So these were the gaps this study was trying to fill. So on this basis, the following research questions were developed. What are autistic adults' personal experiences of homelessness? In what way, if any, do symptoms of autism lead to homelessness? And what do autistic adults who've experienced homelessness consider to be the reason for their homelessness? So 10 participants, 8 who identified as male and 2 who identified as female, were recruited from homeless shelters in 2 cities in the southwest of England. Participants took part in up to 3 in-depth narrative interviews, and narratives were co-constructed and thematically analysed. Interviews were flexible and interview environment and structure were adapted according to need. So I was aware of the association, of course, between autism and social difficulties, and of previous research on autism and narrative production, which has tended to highlight deficits and inability. However, I'd used my master's dissertation to pilot doing narrative interviews with autistic adults and found that participants were capable of producing rich and unique narratives. So I was really starting from a position of presuming ability. So multiple findings, but I'm going to focus on 2 which link back to the scoping review. But before I do so, I'm just going to briefly discuss participants' experiences of homelessness, just to give you a little bit of context. So the majority of participants experienced episodic homelessness across the life course, with 6 participants experiencing their first instance of homelessness in childhood. In terms of forms of homelessness, participants tended to sofa surf when they first became homeless, but soon exhausted contacts and began rough sleeping or staying in squats and vehicles before moving on to longer-term hostels. So whilst homeless, participants struggled to adapt to the lack of routine. Additionally, the chaotic environment of shelters and hostels was difficult for participants with sensory needs and social anxiety. As such, some participants stated a preference for sleeping rough, though they also noted the negative impact this had on mental health. Another issue was that participants were often not considered autistic enough to warrant support. So the majority of participants had a late diagnosis and their symptoms were not necessarily obvious. Additionally, autism does not automatically meet the criteria for priority need, as I was discussing in the introduction, and this meant participants were often left without support for very long periods of time. In one case, it took a participant 12 years to be accepted as statutory homeless and then accepted into a longer-term hostel. Further finding related to the complexity of life experience. Most participants had had traumatic childhoods during which they were subject to physical, emotional, and sometimes sexual abuse. They also often experienced bullying and ostracisation at school and were often segregated and isolated from their peers because of perceived behavioural issues. And all of these experiences had an impact on educational attainment and on mental health. All participants reported some form of substance misuse as a way of coping with mental health, hardship or social anxiety, and 3 have been imprisoned for drug-related offences or violent crime. And finally, all reported at least one co-occurring condition, including bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and participants struggled to understand these, and they were not well supported across the life course. And unfortunately, this included the autism diagnosis, so autism was often misdiagnosed or wasn't diagnosed until adulthood. So it's important to highlight that all of these complex and overlapping factors and experiences cautioned against examining autism in isolation. There was so much going on in participants' lives, and autism was an additional, albeit important, factor. So these two quotes exemplify some of these points. The first is Ellie reflecting on childhood abuse. So Ellie came out as gay and later trans to her mother and experienced emotional and physical abuse, which eventually led to her running away from home at the age of 14 and becoming homeless. And this second quote is from Alex, a 40-year-old man who had experienced episodic homelessness across the life course. He'd been sexually abused in childhood and struggled with lifelong addiction. So this quote really emphasises his traumatic childhood experiences. He explains how he was not even 11 years old before he was given heroin by his father and taken out stealing. So now we come on to the main finding, and this was that participants were at increased risk of homelessness due to the social and economic disadvantages that they experienced. I won't list all of these, but participants were less likely to do well in education, less likely to find and maintain employment. They had small social support networks and were susceptible to relationship breakdown. Now, these risk factors are not unique to autism, as they are general contributors to homelessness. However, data analysis revealed that the rejection of human difference was an influencing factor in the social and economic disadvantages that participants experienced. So rejection of human difference could take place when an autism diagnosis was known or disclosed, and this resulted from stigmatization of autism and discrimination. But it also took place when autism wasn't diagnosed or wasn't disclosed, and this tended to result from rejection of human difference. So when participants did not meet social norms or expectations, they were less likely to, for instance, get through to the next stage of a job application. But either way, ultimately this rejection drove participants into poverty and into homelessness. So here are some examples of this from participants. The first was from Stephen, who was undiagnosed in childhood. He was repeatedly isolated from his class due to his perceived behavioural difficulties, and he was eventually suspended and denied the opportunity to take qualifications. The second example is from Charles, who had a master's degree and explained how he had applied for countless jobs, but he was always turned down, and he believed that this was because of his autism diagnosis. So here he explains how adaptations to interview processes were not useful, and he describes employers as trying to find cardboard cutout candidates and fitting squares into square holes. So I'll finish by discussing implications, and I'll start with some general implications for service providers. Participants reported autism awareness was very low across homelessness services, and this led to difficult exchanges with staff and in some cases eviction or rehousing when participants were seen as non-engaging or non-cooperative. So there's clearly a need to increase autism awareness across services. Services also need to promote a willingness to adapt approaches and environments. Participants were moved through the shelter system with little or no notice and had no choice in their accommodation or their neighbours. Thirdly, most participants felt it was important to have people working in homelessness services who had similar experiences. So participants felt they benefit from speaking to other autistic adults who'd been through the shelter system. As this quote from Ellie exemplifies, she states, "I get where the barriers are, I get where the limitations are." And finally, measures need to extend beyond homelessness services in order to be preventative. Participants were predisposed towards homelessness since childhood, so interventions need to occur earlier and across multiple sectors such as social services, education and employment. So I'll conclude by saying that these implications within existing frameworks are all very well, but they perhaps do not go far enough to address the exclusion participants face throughout their lives. And in my thesis, I argue that it is the permeation of normative ideals throughout society which led to exclusion and ultimately homelessness for participants. And this does not just concern those with a clinical diagnosis, because those without a diagnosis were pushed to the periphery of society by these notions of abnormality. So this is a much wider theoretical discussion for another day, but I'll leave you with the thought that mitigating against the risk of homelessness for autistic adults requires us to trouble and reconstruct accepted values of normalcy and personhood. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Beth for that very interesting presentation on homelessness and cognitive function, particularly relating to autistic spectrum. Now we move on to our third presentation of this symposium, the final presentation of the symposium. And we have something very interesting from Gaëtan Chevreau of Paris 8 University in France. And he's going to present on neuropsychology for homeless services, suitability and challenges for practice and research.
Okay, hello, my name is Gaëtan Chevreau, and I'm a PhD student at the University Paris 8 in France, in the Laboratoire de Psychopathologie et Neuropsychology. My PhD project is about homelessness and cognition. So my presentation of today will be about neuropsychology at homelessness services, suitability and challenges for practice and research. Let's start with an introduction on homelessness in neuropsychology. First of all, the European Federation of National Organizations working with the homeless created a few years ago a typology called ethos to describe different kinds of homelessness and housing exclusion. This typology includes two categories for homelessness. The first one is rooflessness, and this refers to the condition of someone who doesn't have a place to stay or to sleep, so what we call sleeping rough. While the second category, houselessness, refers to the condition of someone who is homeless but does have a place to stay, like in a shelter or any other institutions. Just to let you know, homelessness is actually referenced in the International Classification of Disease, of course not as a medical condition, but as a social factor influencing health status. When we talk about homelessness, I like to use this presentation of the scheme of Suther, Moore and Link, 1993, because it shows a very biopsychosocial perspective on the causes of homelessness. You can see here that there are structural factors influencing homelessness. This includes job and housing market conditions. And then you have many individual factors influencing homelessness, from background factors to young and later adult life. So you can see that sex, age, events and condition in childhood influence homelessness, but also economic and social resources. More interestingly for us, current health status. And today I think we could add another factor to this, which will be the focus of our presentation today. This is cognitive health. So if you have a look on this slide, you see that many factors are a risk factor for cognitive vulnerabilities, and have a high occurrence in the homeless population. First, we know that there is a high occurrence of childhood adversities and traumas in the homeless population, as well as intellectual disabilities. Secondly, we know that there is frequently addictive behaviors, like with alcohol and drug misuse in the homeless population. Then I present here I cite here meta-analysis of Stubbs and collaborators 2020, in which they found out that 53% of the homeless population suffered in their life from at least one traumatic injury from any severity degree. Then, as you might know already, we find a higher prevalence of mental disorders in the homeless population, which includes depression and anxiety, but also psychotic disorders. More recently, studies have shown focused on the neurological health of the homeless population and found out that they have higher prevalence of brain infarcts and higher cardiovascular risks. And finally, it appears that homelessness is associated with an early aging. Here I cite a study of Brown and collaborators, 2017, in which they evaluated the geriatric conditions of a homeless sample with a median age of 58 years old. And this sample had geriatric conditions similar to what is observed in a general population with a median age of 80 years. And all of these factors can influence cognitive vulnerabilities and impairments. So, how is it in the homeless population? I present here a graph of Aklavic and collaborators, 2019. What they call mild cognitive impairment is a cognitive score below -1 standard deviation, while moderate severe cognitive impairment refers to a cognitive score below -2 standard deviation. And as you can see, most of the cognitive functions are highly impaired. This is the case for memory, sustained attention, but also cognitive functioning with inhibitory control or cognitive flexibility. So there is a high prevalence of cognitive vulnerabilities in the homeless population. How is it dealt with in France? I cite here a scoping review on homelessness and cognition from Stone, Bowling, and Cameron, 2018. In these reviews, they identified 40 studies, including 4 reviews and 36 more clinical studies. And I just had a look on the location of these 36 studies, and 32 were conducted in only 4 countries: Canada, UK, USA, and Japan. This means that only 4 of the studies were conducted in other countries, which includes Australia, Mozambique, India, and Netherlands. And none of these studies was conducted in France. In practice, cognition is rarely explored in homeless services. All these elements lead me to the question I'll try to answer in the next part of the presentation. What are the challenges faced by the implementation of neuropsychology into French homeless services? I'll start with structural challenges related to the social context and the national context. And then I'll discuss the use of neuropsychological methods. So let's start with these structural challenges, and more specifically, the French historical context. First, you should know that homelessness has been decriminalized in France in 1994, which means 25 years ago. From then, homelessness is a condition to take care and not anymore a condition to disapprove or anything. The first era after this decriminalization was really focused on an answer to primary needs, providing food and a roof, but really on the short term. Shelters could host homeless people only for a few nights, and then the individual had to go back on the street. This is why Pluck, a French sociologist, spoke of a paradox of chronic emergency, because shelters could not provide any kind of rehabilitation. This progressively changed, and we can take the date of 2007 as a reference, because because of the reinforcement of rights to housing. From this date, from this year, shelters were not allowed anymore to decide of a maximal duration of staying for individuals, and they were obliged to find sustainable solutions at the end of the staying. So since we are experiencing a transition to a long-term assistance, which is more adapted to social and biopsychosocial rehabilitation. So as you can see, this possibility, this opportunity of rehabilitation is quite recent. And another structural challenge can be the separation of medical and social cares in France. Here I just show you two numbers. First, we estimate that 250,000 people are homeless in France. And on the other side, there are less than 5,000 places in medical social homeless centers. This includes the Housing First program and any other nurse care services dedicated to homeless people. So you can see that these places are quite rare, and most of the time healthcare is externalized to other services, like in hospitals or dedicated structures, which conducts to the fact that shelter staff is quite unfamiliar with the health problematic of their users. Yes. And last structural challenge I wanted to present is simply the limits of practicalities. Homeless shelters, at least in France, are often in a repurposed building. As an example, in Paris, many shelters are in former hostels. We even have a shelter in the City Hall of Paris and another one in a former cinema. And the consequence of this is there is not always a consulting room or a dedicated room which can guarantee what is crucial in research hours in clinical practice, which is confidentiality and easy access for the user, and a neutral environment without loud noise outside of the room, for example. And this can be quite a challenge. Okay, I presented to you the structural challenges faced in France to implement neuropsychology. Now I'll discuss the use of neuropsychological methods. First of all, you should know that homelessness experienced very quick changes the past 2 decades. especially in terms of social demographic characteristics. In 2001, 38% of the homeless population were migrants. Today, according to our estimations and estimations from other papers, it rather around 80–90%. So the proportion of migrants raised a lot in only 20 years, and this calls for new problematics, new challenges related to the migrants population. For a few examples which can impact the use of neuropsychological methods, the proportion of homeless people who do not speak French is quite high. It was estimated in 2012 around 20%. And since the European migrant crisis might have increased this proportion, and this is an issue for the use of neuropsychological methods and neuropsychological tests, because even when they do not evaluate verbal functions, a minimum of French is always needed to at least to understand what we have to do, etc. So it's quite difficult to make a neuropsychological assessment when the persons do not speak French at all. The second characteristic is that, per definition, being migrant implies having a different cultural background, and it raises the question of the use of normative data to compare the individual with the normative population, because usually tests are standardized with the French population who went at school, etc. And we know also that culture influences early neurodevelopment. So it might be that the use of French normative data is not the most effective to evaluate this population. Lastly, I just wanted to underline also the fact that many of the homeless individual do not have identification documents, and this can be a problem in research in France, because for biomedical research, it's mandatory for the participants to be registered in the national social security system, and then all the undocumented people couldn't be included in the study, which can be a bias, and then this is a point, an element to keep in mind when developing a study, because it's then needed to ask for a special exemption, so we can include also those people who are actually the most marginalized, even administratively. Okay. I then wanted to discuss the relevance of self-report, because aside of neuropsychological tests, we also use interviews, for example, especially in social services where medical report is not always available. Then self-report can help the neuropsychologist to understand the medical and social history of the individual. But we know that cognitive impairments can impact the quality of self-reports. And A solution could be to contact a relative, like a family member or a close friend, but with the homeless population, it can be difficult to get this access. And then it seems that partnerships with the shelter staff is really important, because they know very well their users, and they can be a helpful partner to understand better the individuals, and also to develop the research itself. Lastly, I wanted to underline that homelessness is associated with a complex medical history and multimorbidities. Here I present a few chronic conditions identified by Henwood and collaborators, 2018. These chronic conditions are known to be prevalent in the homeless population, and they found out that 90% of their sample reported 2 or more chronic conditions at the same time, which means that their medical history is quite complex, and it can make difficult to link the cognitive profile to one cause, because many factors could impact cognition on different levels, on different cognitive functions. Also, it makes even more difficult to rely on self-report, because such complex multimorbidity involves an even more accurate self-report to understand better all these conditions. Just as a quick summary, the different challenges I presented here show that cognitive vulnerabilities may be prevalent in the homeless population, but they remain underexplored in France because of structural factors, especially the very recent interest for healthcare of the homeless population, especially invisible vulnerabilities like mental and cognitive health, and the lack of practicalities in shelters. And on the other side, more individual factors, like the fact that homelessness experienced quick changes these last decades, and that homelessness involves complex situations, which can be difficult to assess. How to conclude this presentation? I wanted to start my conclusion with this very interesting quotes from Forrester and collaborator, 2017. If we acknowledge the need for neuropsychological support, then we have a responsibility to find ways to meet that need. I read that like whatever the challenges we face or we meet, this should not justify inaction, and on the contrary, we should redouble our efforts to overcome the inaction and the challenges we face. This is with this whole framework that we developed my PhD project with my 2 supervisors, Marie-Carmen Castillo and Claire Azoubi. The phase was the methodological development and preparation, which led to the exploratory study in November and December of 2020. This was on a small sample, and the objective was to evaluate the suitability of the protocol and to identify the adaptations we had to realize for the main phase. Because of all these challenges, it was important to see how suitable our protocol was. So the main phase is planned for beginning of 2020, and the objective will be on a larger scale to evaluate more accurately cognitive functioning and associated risk factor for homeless Parisians, as it has not been done to your knowledge so far. And of course, of the longer term, the objective is not only to describe, but to find strategies to integrate cognitive health into the global care provided to people experiencing homelessness. The data are from the exploratory study, are analyzed now, are being analyzed, and will be presented very soon, hopefully. For now, we can share with you the qualitative lessons we learned from this exploratory study. First of all, it seemed very important to empower participants as well as shelter staffs, because participants can be reluctant to participate in a study in which they will be evaluated on the cognition, to share with researchers their stories. So it's important to ask regularly their feedback, to include them also in the adaptations to do in the protocol by asking for their suggestions of improvement. And this is true also for shelter staff. They can be afraid that such biomedical study could pathologize the homeless population. So it's important to organize regular meeting, to answer questions, to describe how the study is going, etc. What's important is to make that individuals, shelter staff, but more importantly participants, that they feel in control. So the study is not a negative experience for them, but a positive one. Secondly, flexibility is really the key word in study in the homeless population, especially because our approach in shelters is ecological. Of course, flexibility is important for any studies in psychology, but because of the lack of practicalities, and also because shelters are where homeless people actually live, it's important to be flexible, also to adapt ourselves to their own intimacy, their own routine, so we don't bother of any kind. Then sharing professional experience and methods appear to be important, especially because psychological intervention seem to lack of visibility in the research community, but also in shelters themselves. So sharing any kind of experience, even small data from exploratory studies, seem important because it's likely that local factors can influence the suitability of a protocol. For example, the lack of practicalities in Paris. And then it's important to have the experience of previous studies or protocols to develop new research and to emerge new research. Last but not least, innovation in the use of measurement tools is needed. This includes the development of neuropsychological tests with normative data more adapted to the homeless population. For example, which includes a migrant sample, or also tests which are more adapted to an allophone population. And also in the use of existing tools, like instead of using normative data, maybe doing intra-group comparison or longitudinal studies to overcome the challenges presented previously. I thank you for your attention, and here I present just the references used in this presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Guy. Now that is the final presentation of this symposium on homelessness and cognitive functioning. We've had 3 presentations today, and I, for one, found it very interesting, and I hope you did too. Thank you very much for coming to this virtual presentation at the 32nd International Congress of Psychology. It's been a very difficult time for all of us. The authors today, Beth, Gaëtan and myself, we've been planning this since 2019, and there's not been lots of stops and starts because of the pandemic, but we're very pleased we've been able to actually get this completed, and I hope some of you have learned some useful information today about homelessness and cognitive functioning. And of course, we'd be very happy, all of us, the authors, if you were to contact us with any further questions. So thank you very much, and goodbye.